Welcome back to another video, and today's topic is why your bench or squat rack height might be the issue for your technique. This is something I've seen kind of pop up with some of my lifters lately, and I've actually talked about the bench rack height a little bit in the video when I talked about to stop over retracting so much, but it hasn't been something I've seen really distinctly discussed. So I want to make a really short video discussing what happens specifically where I see people putting their bench rack height or squat rack height too low, what that then does to their technique, and what simply having the correct rack height is going to do to constrain your technique and fix it. So my recommendation in general for bench and squat rack height is, on average, you want to have it as high as you can and still comfortably unrack, because any lower is only one, creating extra work, and two, getting into the issues you foresee. Now, you don't want to have it too high and then you're having issues with clearance and being able to get it back to the rack, having to protract on your way out on bench press, having to go on your tiptoes, or not being able to get into a good low bar position on your squat rack height. So you don't want it too high, but my general recommendation is you want it as high as you can and still very comfortably be able to unrack and re-rack the weight, because having it too low tends to create issues. So what are those issues? Starting with bench press, it tends to lead to lifters wanting to maintain soft elbows to a larger degree. So what do I mean by that? So this is 2 rack heights lower than I normally use. When I try to go set up, I have to have a fairly bent elbow to get into position. And for me to fully unrack, it is going to be a bit excessive to have to press my elbows all the way out. And I very commonly see lifters do this because it helps them to kind of feel like it promotes them to retract a bit more, which isn't necessarily what we want to do in that initial setup. And what we'll see is they'll get in this position, and instead of pressing their elbows out and then bringing the bar over, what they'll do is just bend the elbows just enough while maintaining that retraction to bring the bar out, maintain those elbows, that retraction, and be kind of stuck in that position. And what that leads to is, one, is soft elbows, and that may be an issue when it comes to actually getting a start command, but two, that issue with over retraction, which I talk about in the video I made on that topic. As well as, when you have soft elbows on bench press, especially excessively soft elbows, you tend to be a little less stable because you require a little bit more active stabilization by the musculature, having to stabilize the weight as you pull it out and hold it over your chest, versus that locked elbow more having the joints be able to support in a more passive stabilization way. So if you're a lifter who constantly has issue with soft elbows, or you're a coach with a lifter who has this issue, and no matter what you tell them, they just can't fix it. No matter what they do, they always tend to unrack, kind of stay a little over retracted, and maintain that soft elbow position. An easy way to fix that a lot of times is through that rack height, because you cannot unrack with soft elbows if you have the correct rack height. If the rack height is in the correct position, there is no way you can maintain that soft elbow position. It will constrain you to having to lock out the elbow and pull it over, aka what I'm going to show here. Here is my correct rack height. So you can see with this, as I set up, I'm in a position where I have less elbow flexion, and to be able to get the bar out, I'm going to either have to do one of two things. I'm either going to have to keep my elbows soft and kind of protract out, which is fairly uncomfortable, and lifters aren't going to want to do that, or I'm going to have to extend the elbow, bring the bar out, and now be into position. And so simply by doing that, I now constrain myself to having to actually lock up my elbows without ever having to really cue that. And I've seen so many lifters who struggle with soft elbows simply raise their rack height up 1 or 2, and it immediately fixes it because there's no way they can get the bar out otherwise. On squat, the exact same thing can happen in a slightly different way. Albeit I find this a little less common than the bench press issue with the rack height being too low on bench press. It does happen on squat too. And if your rack height is too low on squat, one of two things is going to happen. Either one, you are going to have to be fairly squatted down and really have to work to unrack it, which frankly, lifters don't want to do. Again, people usually don't want to protract. They're going to want to stay retracted also because of gravity. So therefore, they're going to bias towards soft elbows. Or if you raise the rack height up, they'll bias to wanting to extend their elbow more versus protracting. On squat, lifters are going to want to bias away from having to do too much work from their legs. Just inadvertently, subconsciously, they're going to want to compensate elsewhere. So where do they compensate? They compensate with the upper back and the back position. So what you'll see a lot of times for lifters who have too low of a rack height on squat is they'll set up pretty depressed and flexed over to get into position, and at the last second, they'll kind of pop up but it's kind of too late for them. At that point, you've kind of messed up your rack position, and this goes back to one of the very first videos I ever made with low bar rack position and bracing, where I really talk about how I would recommend setting up. Once you unrack, you're stuck. You really can't change that bar position on your back. You can somewhat change your rib cage position, but you're not going to change that bar position and kind of the orientation of your scapula and your shoulder or your shoulders and whatnot. So what happens is, like I said, people with that too low of rack height will bias away from overly flexing at the hips and the knee, and instead want to let that rib cage depress more and kind of get stuck in this depressed rib cage position. Versus if we have the correct rack height, one, I don't need to worry about my hip and knee extension and flexion because it's high enough. And then two, I have plenty of room that to get into that low bar position, I'm going to have to be more neutral and straight with my rib cage position to get that bar where I need to. If I'm overly depressed and like this, I actually don't have much room to extend my knees and walk the bar out. It naturally feels better for me to be more upright because I can get that bar to clear and walk it out accordingly. So as I said, short and sweet, but very important. And frankly, I haven't really had too many people I've heard talk about this subject of how you can use your rack height on bench press and squat to constrain your movement. With bench in particular, by making sure you have the right rack height and high enough that it constrains you to having to lock your elbows out to be able to unrack it. And then on squat, making sure that that squat rack setting is high enough so that you actually have to be more neutral to be able to unrack the bar versus somewhat promoting a more depressed and flexed over position with the upper back to be able to fit under the bar and not feel like you have to go through as much knee extension. So per usual, if you like the video, make sure to click the like and the thumbs up button, subscribe, share with a friend if you think they'd find it useful as a tip to aid them in powerlifting. And if you have any questions, make sure to comment below and I'll be happy to answer. But until next time, peace.